So today we are talking about tics and neurotransmitters. And we're really going to dive into this. I have looked at a study, and so I'm going to go through this study with you. We're going to talk about, okay, that's great data, but I was just talking to my mom, and I was just telling her, she goes, did you see that new study on erythritol? And I said, I did, but there's no competing studies. And the other thing is, what's missing from the study? You always want to ask what's missing from the study. So I'm obviously not the only one in my family reading studies, but you always want to ask what's missing from the study. So today on TikTok Tuesday, we're talking about tics and neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about the study. We're going to talk about what's missing. We're going to talk a little bit more about neurotransmitters. So there was a study, and this is a 2022 study. So there's studies all the time. So what I want to starting over. Here's what I want to point out about studies. That studies are taught in medical school. We know that. We're taking this study, we're taking this data, we're taking this research, we're going to teach it in medical school. Studies that happened in 2022 are estimated to not be taught in medical school for 30 years. 30 years. So you're looking at 2052 that we are going to teach this stuff in medical school. So you have to understand that these are not things that you're going to go to your pediatrician and neurologist, unless they're reading current studies, that they're going to be able to analyze this data for you, because it's not what they learned in medical school. It takes 30 years. So they do a study, they take all of these studies from 2022, they're going to rewrite whatever medical school textbook they have, and they're going to then analyze that data and say, okay, these are the most valid studies. These kind of correlate. These are the things that we're going to put in there. They have to write the book. They have to print the book. They have to teach it. They have to come up with a curriculum. Then they have to teach it. So you have to understand that these kinds of studies, it's going to be years before they're taught in medical school. So, a lot of us in the functional world will put an alert on like PubMed and then get alerted for studies. And so we can read the current studies and really start to evaluate that data. And this is where I think you need to have the skill to be able to evaluate data. You have to be able to know, okay, well, this is good info, but what's missing? What might also play a role in this study? So this is a really, really basic study from 2022, and it's a pilot study on plasma and urine neurotransmitter levels in children with tic disorders. So they collected 94 samples of plasma. So just know when we're looking at plasma levels, this is a lot of times where I'm like, blood work isn't always valid, is because when we're looking at plasma levels, we are only looking at what's in the plasma. We're not looking at what is in the cell. And in some cases we can, like we can look at magnesium RBC, like what's in the red blood cell. But in most cases, we're only looking at plasma. So one, we're not looking at what's in the cell. And when we look at urine neurotransmitter testing, which I do with clients, we are looking at those metabolites. So basically, what are those waste byproducts that are created when we're utilizing neurotransmitters? And then we look at those levels. So this is really kind of how we look at an organic acids test. Is we're looking at a urine test. We're not measuring the exact neurotransmitter. We're measuring that those waste byproducts, those metabolites. So they collected 94 samples of plasma and 69 samples of urine from kids ages 3 to 12 in China. So this was a Chinese study. And then they took the same number of samples from quote unquote healthy kids who had nothing wrong. And they matched age and sex and physical examination and really started to kind of correlate this data. What this study found is plasma levels of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, glutamic acid, as well as the urine levels were higher in kids with children with tic disorders. So what their conclusion of the study was yes, they're higher in children with tic disorders. This study kind of lays the foundation for further research. Someone wants to pick it up and do further research. So great, just like last week we talked about vitamin D levels, where we talked about kids in the study had kids with tic disorders had low vitamin D levels. So in this study, kids, when they measured the plasma and the urine neurotransmitters, kids had higher levels of certain neurotransmitters. So great information. So they've got higher levels. What's missing? Let's talk about what's missing. Where are 90% of your neurotransmitters created? 90%, about 90%, and it's definitely an estimate, are created in the gut. right? So if we're looking at this and we see that these kids have, higher levels of dopamine, higher levels of norepinephrine, higher levels of glutamic acid, what are we talking about? Well, if we're making a lot of these in the gut, there are certain parasites that can increase dopamine levels in your children, certain parasites in the gut. So if you have a gut that's imbalanced, maybe you have a parasite, and not everybody has a parasite, so don't go down the parasite rabbit hole. Okay, not everybody has a parasite. But some parasites and gut imbalances and inflamed guts can change the way that your neurotransmitters are produced. If you're eating a bunch of foods that you shouldn't be eating, that they don't agree with you, that can change the way that your neurotransmitters are created. If you are maybe celiac and you are not absorbing nutrients, it's going to change the way that your neurotransmitters are created. Do you guys know what food source we need in order to create neurotransmitters? In order to create really good neurotransmitters, we need protein. We need to eat protein in order to create neurotransmitters. We break down the protein into amino acids and we use that to create neurotransmitters. In conjunction with certain nutrients. You have to have what's called cofactors in here. So we know that folate in the system is going to help us make serotonin and dopamine. And if we don't have enough folate, maybe we're not making enough serotonin and dopamine in the first place. So one, you have to have protein to create neurotransmitters, but you also have to have the cofactors, the nutrition that goes with it. So it's really more of a complex issue than just, these kids have higher neurotransmitter levels. So one, what this study is missing is what's going on with these kids' guts. If we could do a really complex study about neurotransmitters and tics, well, what's happening with these kids' guts? Do they have food sensitivity? Do they have parasites? Do they have candida overgrowth? Do they have leaky gut? What are these aspects that could be impacting neurotransmitters in the gut? Okay. The next thing I'm going to talk about is neurotransmitters in the brain. One significant neurotransmitter in the brain being GABA. So your brain is full of glutamic acid. It is important for brain function. Some people genetically have imbalanced glutamic acid and GABA. So what happens is we take this glutamic acid and we turn it into GABA. It is a calming neurotransmitter. So 3 or 4 in the afternoon, our body's going to start taking that glutamic acid in our brains and turning it into GABA so that we are calm and relaxed and can go to sleep later. GABA is not necessarily about sleep. It's just about giving us that calm, relaxed state. Kids that have a lot of higher GABA levels experience anxiety, dysphoria. So dysphoria is kind of like negative Nancy or, glass half empty, like everything sucks. Some of them frequently have higher levels of constipation. So we have to look at all of these things that are really applicable with what's happening with GABA. So here's what I want you to understand about GABA. One, we can start out with a genetic predisposition to having higher glutamic acid levels in the brain. So having a GABA glutamate imbalance. We're going to pause. I have to look back to what we were talking about with the GABA. You start with that genetic imbalance. Not everybody has the genetic imbalance. Some people do, some people don't. You end up with higher levels of glutamate, lower levels of GABA. There are ways to balance that if we know your genetics. But the other thing we have to look at is inflammation. You guys hear me talk about inflammation all the time. Inflammation is not just systemic. It's not just, our little inflammation in our pinky finger. Oh, my pinky finger hurts. Yes, you twist your ankle. It gets red, it gets swollen. It's very important. Inflammation is actually a very important piece of our immune system. It's when that inflammation goes unchecked, it goes unregulated, and it really starts to imbalance the immune system. You've heard me talk about the study of imbalanced immune systems and tic disorders. It's my favorite study. So when we start to talk about inflammation and glutamate levels, what happens when we experience inflammation, it is not just in our pinky finger. It is systemic. It will impact our brain. We have specialized immune cells in our brain called microglial cells. When we are inflamed, when we are stressed, when we have a head injury, we will then have what's called a glutamate storm. Our brains will be flushed with glutamate. Very, very excitatory. It is part of a protective mechanism. So when those microglial cells become activated, we get a glutamate storm, we have higher levels of glutamate, and we sometimes have a really hard time converting those levels of glutamate into this calming amount of GABA. So these kids in this study have higher glutamic acid levels. What is that contributor to those glutamic acid levels. This study is not telling us, well, is it because they have genetic predisposition? Is it because they have a lot of inflammation that's increasing these glutamic acid levels in the brain? And then when we have an increase of glutamic acid, we end up with excess calcium. Calcium starts to damage and kill neurons when we have excess calcium in the brain. So it's really, when we're looking at these studies about neurotransmitters, great. This is a great study. It's telling us that kids with tic disorders have these imbalanced neurotransmitters, that they're definitely at higher levels. But what we want to know is, why are they at higher levels? What's happening in the gut? What's happening in the brain? What's happening in the immune system? So you have to look at the connection between neurological and immune system. There is a connection. And this is where I really start to bring in that comprehensive neuroimmune analysis, looking at those 935 biomarkers, really looking at what are these biomarkers saying, and then using the foundational connection method to connect those dots to what, symptoms your kid is experiencing. So for example, if you have high levels of dopamine, you might experience agitation and anxiety. You might be very pleasure seeking, like, oh, you want to touch everything and rub everything. Maybe you're very high energy. In adults, it could really be high libido, hyperactivity. People with high dopamine levels can experience insomnia. Some people with high dopamine may have enhanced learning, but we can look at mania, we can look at motivation, we can look at organizational thoughts and paranoia. So there's so many things that go into imbalanced neurotransmitters, right? And you can go down a neurotransmitter rabbit hole like no other, but you have to look at what is impacting those neurotransmitters. And this is why it's really, really important for me to be able to look at those biomarkers. Because when we look at that genetic predisposition, we know, hey, you're predisposed to these high GABA, or low GABA, high glutamate levels. Or, hey, you're predisposed to this chronic aggressive inflammation. Hey, you have this gene where you might have more pathogens in the gut, and we're gonna look at what's happening in the gut. So there's so many factors that can impact your neurotransmitters that just having a study telling us that neurotransmitters are imbalanced is great, but we have to be able to discern why those neurotransmitters are imbalanced in the first place. And for kids with tics, it's not just about neurotransmitters. It is about so many factors. It's about the food that they're eating. It's about the inflammation. It's about what's going on in their immune system. It's about what's happening in their gut. You will go to the neurologist and you're going to be told tics are purely neurological. I highly, highly, highly disagree. I highly disagree. Tics are not just neurological. They are above and beyond those neurological issues. There are things happening in the body that are causing neurological imbalance, but tics are not purely neurological. So when my clients are working with me, we're going to take into consideration neurotransmitters, but it's not the first thing that we're going to take into consideration. And we're not going to just start to shoot in the dark and be like, oh, maybe you have high dopamine. Oh, you have anxiety, maybe you have high dopamine. Well, you might have high dopamine, or you might have high glutamic acid, or maybe you have a lot of inflammation, or maybe you have, low B vitamins. So it's really this more complex issue. So this is where I use that comprehensive neuroimmune analysis with my clients. We want to analyze the data. People hear, that I'm a doctor of holistic nutrition, and they hear the word holistic and they think, oh, crazy Dr. Piper, she's going to sage us and rub her crystals on us. No, I want to look at the data, and I'm going to look at the connection for the whole body. That's holistic, that's functional. We're looking at the whole entire body. So I use that comprehensive neuroimmune analysis to test, don't guess. Test, don't guess. We want to know what's happening inside the body. And then we're going to foundational connection method. We're going to connect the dots. And then restorative rescue strategy. This is where I'm giving parents the plan, the layout, the guide. It is not an overnight thing. There is no magical pill, potion, or magic bean. We are then going to create a plan, long-term and short-term goals to help people be successful. So it's not just about neurotransmitters. I want you to understand that we can look at all of these studies, and I'm going to go back to last week's study and say it's not just about vitamin D. Not every child has a vitamin D issue. I have a kid right now who's responding very well to a supplement that a lot of my clients take, and parents are wanting to know, well, why is that? And I'm like, well, it really has to do with genetics. It's not magnesium or B6. But not everybody responds that way, and it's the way that this kid's body works, because we're looking at that unique approach. What is that unique approach? What is that unique individual thing happening inside your child's body?